This is a CBC News special report.
And you're looking live at Rideau Hall, the official residence of the Governor General. And that Rideau Hall is home to many of the procedures that are at the heart of our democracy. And one of those is the calling of a national election. And that's what's going to happen here in the next half hour or so. Of the ceremonial guard takes their positions outside Rideau Hall. We will see the Prime Minister, Conservative leader Stephen Harper, arriving here within the next 20-25 minutes to meet the Governor General, who will then okay the idea of a federal election for October 19th. And good morning, I'm Peter Mansbridge. So here we are, the middle of summer, the middle of a holiday weekend in August, and we're going to the polls for an October 19th election, 77 days away. That is an awfully long campaign. In fact, there are only two campaigns that have been longer in this country. The very first one in 1867, and then the second one in 1872. Normally, campaigns in these last 20-25 years have been roughly around 35, 36 days. This one, 77 days. That will be one of the key questions to Stephen Harper in the next half hour or so. Why such a long campaign? How he answers that question will be very interesting on this morning. Lots of theories as to why. What will he say in public about the reason for a long campaign? Let's go up to Ottawa and just outside Rideau Hall, where our senior correspondent Terry Malefsky is standing by. Terry, tell us what it's like there this morning.
Well, it's a perfect day. This is a whole lot better, Peter, than that chilly March day in 2011, you may recall, when people were freezing out here waiting for the Prime Minister. This time, we have much better weather. There's also a lot of history going on because people are trying to figure out exactly, well, what is this that the media keeps saying this is the longest campaign in modern times? Well, what does modern times mean? If you go back, Peter, you just said you went back to 1872 and you were right, although big difference. 1872, that election, although some places had campaigns as long as 96 days, others had as few as 5 days. And remember, there were only 6 provinces voting. Alberta, Saskatchewan, PEI, Newfoundland didn't exist in that campaign. So there are so many differences, really, that you could fairly say that if you count the writ period, not the period from the dissolution of Parliament to the election day, but from the issuing of the writs, we're not supposed dropping the writs, we're not supposed to say that anymore. But the point is that this really is the longest writ period in Canadian history, period. Never mind this in modern times. One other thing I'll mention is that the other, trying to fill in the gap while we wait for the Prime Minister to visit the Governor General here, Peter, is we're doing some numbers. And of course, we're also, the shorthand is that this could be as much as a $50 million campaign because of the doubling of the writ period. Well, not quite. That's wrong too, because in addition to the 50 million, you've also got to count the in excess of 70 million, that's 70 million, in addition that the candidates will spend. In other words, we're really talking about a $125 million campaign, not a $50 million campaign. Sorry to be boring, but, you know, got to get the history right.
Not boring at all for a Sunday morning. It's fascinating. $125 million, and we should underline what you're talking about there. Those are tax dollars as opposed to the tens of millions that will be spent by the parties. Okay, not exactly.
No,
break it down for us.
Total, that'd be the total spent, period. But half of that goes back to the parties. Half of what the parties spend, they get 50 cents on the dollar back, so they get 25 million out of that 50. But the candidates get 60 cents on the dollar back, so that's 60% of the 72, 73 million that the candidates could be allowed to spend. That's the maximum, remember. Many candidates may not raise the maximum, but often overlooked here is that when people say that the Conservatives have the most money and that Stephen Harper is effectively trying to give himself an unfair edge by calling the election early to give himself the opportunity to take advantage of higher maximums, nevertheless, it's also true that the Conservative writing associations also have way more money than their opposition. So they have an advantage across the board, and it looks like the Prime Minister is about to take that advantage. Thank you very much.
All right, and the bottom line, though, in what you're saying is you analyze those numbers and put them in their correct perspective, is the fact a longer campaign will mean more public dollars being spent, tax dollars being spent than it would have been.
Oh, yeah. I haven't even told you the whole of it. What about Elections Canada? Elections Canada's got to rent offices in 338 ridings now. Some of those ridings, by the way, big northern ridings, they may have to have 2 offices. They've got to pay the returning officer. They've got to pay the deputy returning officer throughout a much longer campaign, and they have to rent the offices for a much longer campaign. So they were estimating, what, $375 million for the cost of a 5-week campaign. You don't double it because most of the costs are on election day. Those don't change, but tens of millions of dollars in addition to what we've already discussed will be added to the taxpayers tab to pay for Elections Canada's job of simply carrying out the election. You got to have an office to receive somebody who says, I've got my nomination papers here. Where do I file them? They've got to go to an Elections Canada office to do that, and all of the other things, administering the advance polls, keeping up to date with the voters list, all of that has to be done somehow, and it all costs money.
All right, sure does. All right, Terry, thanks very much. Terry will be with us throughout this next hour and a half or so as we not only hear from Stephen Harper, but hear from some of the opposition leaders as well, the other party leaders who will be in this campaign. The one we won't hear from this morning, Justin Trudeau, the Liberal leader, who's on a plane heading to Vancouver. This has been kind of known for the last few days, but the Liberals have made the decision that Trudeau will speak later on today, missing the kind of window of opportunity that's afforded all the parties on live network television throughout the morning during the Rideau Hall announcement by Stephen Harper. Tom Mulcair will be speaking just across the river in Gatineau, Quebec, just across from Parliament Hill. In fact, if we take a peek at the shot he's got lined up, there it is. They're just testing it out right now. Obviously, that's not Tom Mulcair, but one of the NDPP officers. What you see in the background, of course, Parliament Hill. That's the backdrop they'll be using for their reaction to the election call. We'll hear from Gilles Duceppe, Elizabeth May as well, but once again, Justin Trudeau will be later today. He's attending the Pride Vancouver parade in Vancouver on this day. That's why he's flying out to Vancouver for this Sunday. All right, let's stay with Rideau Hall. Go to Rosie Barton, host of Power and Politics. She's watching all this. Rosie, one of the things that Stephen Harper has been accused of is not answering questions, is not taking reporters' questions at various events or restricting it to only a few questions. What's going to happen here today? He comes out and makes a statement. Will he take questions?
I guess that's the first question, and I mean, we've been told that from the moment the campaign begins, he goes back to taking questions every day, and that means 4 questions from what we understand, and maybe a 5th for a regional reporter, depending on where he is in the country. So one would assume that today he'll take some questions, and he probably should, right, for the very reasons that you laid out off the top there, that there are legitimate questions that he needs to frame and answer as this gets going, and the primary one is why now and why so long, and he has to have good answers for that. In terms of the people that we've been talking to leading up to what quickly became the worst kept secret in Ottawa about this election call, the kinds of things Conservatives were saying were 2 or 3-fold. One, it was about money, but not the money things that Terry outlined so well for you there, but the third-party advertising that we've seen a bit of a rise in with groups like Engage Canada and others who were going after the Conservatives. They are allowed to spend as much money as they want outside of a writ period. Once the writs are drawn up, that is no longer the case. And so there is a framework around how third parties can advertise, just as there is around other parties. The other thing that they've been telling us, the Conservatives, is, listen, everybody's campaigning anyway. Tom Mulcair did 10 days in Southern Ontario. Justin Trudeau's been, you see, he's out in British Columbia today. Let's put the limits around it, so this is the beginning of a real campaign. And then thirdly, and you can argue that this may or may not be the case, they say, Conservatives again, that this allows Canadians more time to get to know everybody and to get to know their policy. That may be, but, and this speaks to what you were saying at the beginning, that assumes that people are going to be paying attention, and we hope they are, but it assumes that people are going to be paying attention, and it assumes that everybody will be, explaining policy every day. And if we're looking at 77 days, it's probably not possible. They probably don't have enough of a narrative to get them through those 77 days. So it's going to be a campaign unlike anything we've seen before for lots and lots of reasons. Length is just one of them.
Quickly on the, you and a few others were kind of breaking the news midweek last week on Wednesday that this was coming as of today, that the election would be called. So it's not like it's a surprise, as you said. But for Justin Trudeau, the decision by the Liberals to not make him available within this hour, so when all the focus is on all the different leaders, has there been much discussion or surprise around that?
Well, listen, Tom Mulcair was also supposed to be in Vancouver today and go to the Pride Parade, and his team has decided to take a different approach. That shot you showed earlier is the exact spot where Jack Layton launched his 2011 campaign. So they're trying to show that they are in the game from the get-go and try and get their message out early. I think Justin Trudeau's team is taking a different approach. They're saying, okay, you're calling the campaign and you're going to do that within your terms, but we're going to do things within our terms. And that's a different approach, but I think the risk for him is, that it takes him out of the news cycle for the immediate, for the short term anyway, right? There's a whole morning that's going to go through where we're going to hear from the leaders of the parties who are going to be able to frame this from day one. And the Liberal voice won't be there. So we will get it. We'll get it tomorrow. It's hardly a fatal wound of any kind, but it's clearly a different strategic choice to show Justin Trudeau in a different part of the country doing something entirely different that is campaign-like, but isn't sort of an official shot in front of Parliament, launching his campaign in that way. It's a different choice, and we'll see whether or not it pays for him.
All right, Rosie, thanks. We'll be back to Rosie Barton outside Rideau Hall as this morning progresses. Let's give you a sense of where all this is really taking place today, because Rideau Hall, as we said, the home of the Governor General, the official residence of the Governor General, is at the center of what is going to take place on this morning. It's at 1 Sussex Drive, just a few minutes by car north and east of Parliament Hill. It's been the official residence of the GG of Canada since Confederation. The Government of Canada bought the property, which includes a huge and beautiful park, in 1868 for about $82,000. Bit of a bargain back then. Sits almost right across the street of the Prime Minister's residence in 24 Sussex Drive. Well, a part of all our political coverage for years now has been the At Issue panel. Andrew Coyne is actually off at the lake. He's on holidays this week. Won't be back for a couple of days yet. But both Bruce Anderson, who's in Ottawa, and Chantal Hébert, who is in Montreal today, are with us and anxious to see what's going to unfold. Chantal, what are you going to be watching for in these opening statements?
Well, obviously, I'm going to be listening to Stephen Harper's actual narrative to justify this very long campaign. A lot of people have put narratives into his mouth, but he said that he didn't want to speculate on his own behavior. So we get the real thing today. I figure that the Conservatives think, and probably rightly, that by October 19th, after Thanksgiving, the narrative of why the election was so long will have faded from memory, and we will all, including voters, have moved on to something else. I'm also going to be watching Thomas Mulcair's approach to the campaign. He is not Jack Layton, although he is in the same spot. He's in a good position to launch the campaign. But if you look at the coverage, you look at the comments, people are ready to cast a more critical eye on him. And it will be interesting, especially since he announced Friday that he would probably do none of the debates that Stephen Harper is not doing. So I'm going to be interested in what kind of a mix he puts forward on that day. Remember, it looks like these days don't matter, but you were there and I was there when Kim Campbell famously said on this day that there would not be an improvement in the job situation until God knows when in the future, and Jean Chrétien seized on that to say she doesn't care about ordinary Canadians, and if I'm Prime Minister, I'm going to worry about jobs not in 10 years, but right away. So these days do matter.
You know, just to catch up on something that Rosie Barton and I talked about, we were wondering whether the Prime Minister would take questions. We're now being told, in fact, he will take questions, but there will be just 5 questions, and I imagine that will be broken down into some in English, some in French. We'll see. Now, on Chantal's point about the, wondering how long things may be discussed in terms of the length of the campaign, I totally agree with that. Often what's happens at the beginning of a campaign doesn't really stretch out throughout the campaign, although there are other times when they do, and Chantal mentioned the Kim Campbell quote. was one that kind of haunted her throughout that campaign. Bruce, in Ottawa, what are you going to be watching for?
Well, Peter, I've been looking at the polls over the last several weeks, and what I'm seeing is pretty straightforward math. There are 50% of voters who say that they want change in Ottawa. There are 20% who say they're sure that they don't want change, and the other 30% are really up for grabs. And so in terms of what the Prime Minister's got to do, he's got to focus on that 30%, and he's either going to do one or both of two things. First is he's got to take an approach that is going to charm more of those voters. A lot of those voters are saying, I'm not sure how I feel about the record of this government, but I don't feel great about the Prime Minister most days. His negatives are high among this group. So I'll be watching for the tone that he takes, how many questions he answers, whether he answers those in a manner that speaks to an openness, to a willingness to be grilled by people, because he's set himself up for a very long grilling. I think that's one of the things to bear in mind about this long election campaign. I think the other thing that he's got to try to do, obviously, and he's been doing some of it with advertising so far, is really hammer away at the other two leaders and create that sense of uncertainty about what would happen to the country if Tom Mulcair or Justin Trudeau were Prime Minister. Whether he does that personally and how often he does it, and whether it comes across as being overly aggressive and un-prime ministerial, is another thing I'll be watching for. So for Stephen Harper, tone, style, manner on the campaign trail is going to be incredibly important. I happen to think that a long election campaign doesn't create more of an opportunity for parties to run a highly disciplined, error-free campaign. Instead, it seems to me like there's greater potential for mishaps to happen. Information travels at lightning speed, even if this campaign is going to feel like it's going at a snail's pace some days. And so there's more risk for everybody in this particular scenario.
Yeah, you're right about that. Information does travel at lightning speed now, and so does social media in terms of what can suddenly launch an issue, sometimes unfairly, but nevertheless it does in fact happen. Things go viral, and suddenly your game is thrown off course. Chantel Bruce will be with us throughout the morning, the At Issue team, so we'll be back to them in a bit. Just to set the scene once again, we're only a few minutes away. Somewhere in the next 5 or 10 minutes, the Prime Minister will be leaving 24 Sussex Drive. We gave you that sense in the map of how close it is to Rideau Hall. We're going to have a look at we've got a live shot from 24 Sussex. We'll be expecting to see the Prime Minister leaving. We are assuming he's going to be driving, even though it's a short distance. There's security issues and all that, but there have been times where Prime Ministers past on days like this will take the walk from 24 Sussex across Sussex Drive to the entrance of Rideau Hall and walk up those through those beautiful gardens towards the Governor General's residence. That should be happening somewhere in the next 5 or 10 minutes, and everything starts to unfold. They have a little meeting inside Rideau Hall, the Prime Minister and the GG, that is not on camera, where the actual business of calling an election takes place. Then the Prime Minister will come out, make a statement, and answer, as we're told now, 5 questions. So you heard Terry talking about the dropping of the writ or the issuing of the writs. Kind of political jargon that we've all heard over the years, but what in fact does it really mean? Well, for most people, you know, it doesn't mean very much. You've no doubt heard one such phrase, that dropping the writ. We were wondering where that comes from, and we asked Tom Perry to look into it.
Canadian parties have not run attack ads until after the writ was dropped.
It's one of those phrases you hear every time an election is called. What does that even mean? When it comes to federal elections, it's the Prime Minister who gets the ball rolling. It all starts when he or she visits the Governor General, the Queen's representative, and recommends Parliament be dissolved. It's just an expression. The Governor General issues a proclamation, and here's where the writ comes in. After they've met, the Prime Minister and Governor General direct Canada's Chief Electoral Officer to issue writs of election. These are formal notices sent to each returning officer in every federal riding across the country. The writs instruct each of those ridings to hold an election to choose a new Member of Parliament. Now, nothing is actually dropped, at least not on purpose. It's unclear where the phrase "drop the writ" even came from. There is a theory, though, it's shorthand for "draw up a writ." Wherever it came from, once the writs are drawn up or dropped, the election is on. In Canada, those writs customarily set the minimum length of a federal campaign at 37 days, but there is no maximum length, giving candidates across the country and party leaders at least 5 weeks to make their pitch to voters as they try to form Canada's new government.
That's Tom Perry for us, and now you know. All right, let's bring the insiders in. They're also part of our political campaign coverage over the years, throughout the time period between elections, and now we're into it. Jamie Watt, who has worked many campaigns over the years with the Conservatives, Kathleen Monk, ditto with the NDP, and in Ottawa today, David Hurley, who has worked a number of different campaigns for the Liberals. So you people look at this differently than reporters. You look at it strategically. And when you're watching these kind of opening statements and answering of questions from the various leaders, what are you watching for, Jamie?
Well, normally we're watching for the leader to frame how they see the choice that's coming up in the election. But we're in uncharted territory, and I think anyone who knows takes lessons from the past and tries to apply them to this 78-day campaign is in very dubious land. We see Mr. Trudeau, for example, not even participating in this first hour or so of kickoff. So there's one new choice that someone is making.
And as Rosie said, he's making a choice there.
And he's making a choice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I'm still looking for is what we usually look for, which is what's the election all about? I think the Prime Minister has to come out after he's seen the Governor General and say, this is why I want Canadians to make a choice now, and Mr. Mulcair will say why it's time to choose change that works.
All right, Kathleen?
But for those of us who work in politics, really, election campaigns are like the Olympics. It's a big deal, and today, on the issuing of the writ, it is really like the opening ceremony. So we see some pageantry involved. We'll see some deliberate choices around where the leader is staged, where they make their opening statements. And Jamie's totally right. They'll be framing up the election in terms of how they want the ballot question eventually to be framed for electors. I think we'll also have to watch for what the next key events are. I think truly the first event in this election campaign is going to be Thursday when we see that first event. But I'd be watching for where the leaders go. The thought is that Harper will go to Mount Royal today and Montreal. That's sending a distinct signal that he's looking to reclaim some of territory in Montreal and in Quebec, gain back some of those seats. And it'll be interesting to see where the other leaders are today.
All right, David, give us more on a sense of this framing of the election, framing of the ballot question. What are you expecting in terms of what these leaders will be trying to do in this next hour?
Well, that's also jargon, like you were talking earlier, so let's boil this down. The ballot question, when people talk about that in politics, they're talking about, if you look forward to October the 19th, as people walk into the ballot box, what do you want them to be thinking about? And the truth of the matter is that election campaigns are not about persuasion or explanation or education. If you're doing any of those things, you're probably in some difficulty. Election campaigns are about getting people to think about the things you want them to think about. That's what they mean by framing this up the ballot question. Every party has strengths and weaknesses, and they want you to think about the areas in which they have competitive strengths rather than weaknesses.
All right, David, just let me interrupt you for a second. Keep the thought going, but we're looking now at pictures of the Prime Minister's motorcade with all its security attached to it, lots of it, traveling out of 24 Sussex and heading towards Rideau Hall. So we'll keep watching those pictures, but David, sorry to hit you in mid-thought there.
No, not a bit. So what you're looking for, what's interesting about the Prime Minister's decision to limit questions, for example, is that all of these opening statements are incredibly tightly scripted, well worked over. There will be no errors that anybody can anticipate in these opening statements. But it is possible in the question and answer session for people to get thrown off their own ballot question, for people to say something or to introduce an idea that actually puts them off their stride for a few days. So really it's the Q&A after the opening statements that I'll be looking at today.
So in many ways, well, you know, we're witnessing the opening act, as Kathleen said, but it becomes very unpredictable. As soon as those opening statements are over, anything can happen.
Well, and Peter, it's not just the statements. What we're just seeing now as we watch the Prime Minister's motorcade is the importance of the pictures as well. And I can't imagine any Prime Minister would really want those to be the first pictures. I mean, why? I think you'd want him to be able to walk across the street. So this shows security concerns and others are telegraphing messages to the electorate that maybe aren't always the ones you choose.
I always thought the
Interesting
Prime
point,
Minister had a tremendous advantage on this day, whoever the Prime Minister of the day was, because Jamie's right, the visuals are so powerful, and the ability to go to the Governor General as the Prime Minister, have that official backdrop, and basically call the election, and at that point lay out what you as the Prime Minister say this election is about. I've always thought that the Prime Minister had a tremendous advantage on day one.
Yeah, and it's a day one advantage, not necessarily continuing for the next 76 days.
That's right.
You get the opening shot.
And let's not kid ourselves. Most people, most Canadians are still cranking up the barbecue. They're still at the cottage. They're at their lake. They're in bed. They're enjoying their Sunday morning, or hopefully somewhere delightful. And they're going to wake up, Tuesday after the holiday, Wednesday, Thursday, realize that there's an election campaign that's been called while they were out at the, at the lake or whatever, and then they're going to start making their decisions and judging then. I think that's why the debate on Thursday, people will start tuning in at that point.
All right, Kathleen, Jamie, and David with us, the insiders, and we'll hear from them afterwards to see who got through that opening statement and opening questions without any problems or with problems. So we'll hear from them. We just saw the Prime Minister going inside Rideau Hall. He'll be meeting now with the Governor General. Our cameras are not allowed in the residence today, but we did take these pictures of the inside a little earlier if you haven't seen it. Not surprisingly, there is a lot of political history inside Rideau Hall. Famous names like Michener, Vanier, Sauvé, Natishin. The Governor General's office is at the far end of the residence. That's usually where the election writs are signed. Sometimes they use the smaller sitting room that is right next to the office, right there. It's kind of like the working office for the Governor General. All right, so the Prime Minister's inside. We're told that could be fairly short, anywhere from sort of 10 to possibly 15 minutes. As they go through the procedure and exchange the niceties that take place on a day like this. And then it's game on. The Prime Minister comes outside, then becomes still obviously the Prime Minister, but for the most part of these next 77 days, he's the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, trying to put the Conservative message forward about what another Conservative administration would do, while his counterparts in the other parties are trying to do the same thing. Let's go back to Rideau Hall. Start off with Rosie Barton this time. It didn't look like the Prime Minister had anything to say. It was just sort of straight in.
I guess he's saving his answers for when he comes out. Those 5 questions that we are expecting him to take. The first one will be asked by our own Terry Malevsky. There was a draw. He won. I thought it would be helpful to touch on a couple things that will be different from today. And that is normally, in a normal campaign, in a regular campaign, when it's 35 to 37 days, what you would see now is reporters jumping on buses and planes and taking off across the country. That's not going to happen today. The Conservatives are going to roll out to a rally in Montreal on a bus later today. But the other 2 leaders, we've already talked about Justin Trudeau being in Vancouver. Tom Mulcair will do this event today in Ottawa, and that's sort of it. The fact that there is this debate on Thursday is really changing the nature of the beginning of this campaign. It's partly because it's August and it's a holiday-long weekend, but it's partly because there is a pacing thing going on here. Not everyone can put their guy's face on a big giant plane and jet across the country 25 times within 1 week. They're going to run out of money, and they're probably going to run out of steam. So these next days, I think you will see very light events, not 3 or 4 things a day. You will not hear from the leaders necessarily every day. They will be prepping for that first debate, that Maclean's debate, which will be so key in terms of setting the stage for where they're trying to frame one another. But it's also a question of money, right? They can't blow all their money right out of the gate, and they can't blow all of their money if they think that people aren't paying attention. So in the early weeks, you're going to see more bus tours, some minivans, maybe some regional planes flying to particular locations in the country, but you won't see the sort of giant machine the Canadians may have become accustomed to, reporters certainly have become accustomed to. That's not going to happen. It's not going to look like that this time around.
Okay, there are going to be differences. And just to mention a little more on that debate, Rosie, as you said, the first one Thursday, we had never seen that before, a debate in the first week of a campaign, and the impact that could possibly have. It is, as Rosie said, being done by Maclean's, part of the Rogers media empire, and Paul Wells, the Maclean's writer, will be moderating, hosting that debate and asking the questions. Now, there's been a lot of kind of action on Twitter. As you know, there's been a debate around the debates for these last couple of months, really, about how many debates there'd be, who'd have them, whether the TV consortium, which has always done the debates in the past, would have one or would not have one. They do have a proposal in front of the parties right now. But there has been a lot of discussion these last few days, especially in social media, about, why aren't the consortium partners broadcasting the Maclean's Rogers debate? And just to clarify that, you should know that part of the process from Rogers is that they are denying live access to that debate to other media organizations. So that's why it won't be simulcast in our case on this network, CBC Television or CBC News Network. So just to clarify that point, not that it's not going to get a lot of coverage, because I'm sure it will. All right, let's talk to Terry again. Terry Malevsky, who's outside Rideau Hall as well. Rosie, let it drop there that you'll be asking the first question. It was done by a draw. I'm sure they're really happy to hear, Terry, that you are asking the first question. Terry's always had a very good history in terms of a direct history of challenging the Prime Minister on various issues over the years, including past campaigns, because getting towards Stephen Harper in past campaigns has not always been easy. We won't ask you what your question will be, because that would be unfair. It would leak out fairly quickly. They'd be scribbling away possible answers in the background right now. But give us a sense of that dynamic of asking the Prime Minister questions, because it has been an issue not just for journalists but for the public over these last few years.
Well, controlling access, of course, is Stephen Harper's watchword. This is what he has done ever since he gained power. In fact, this time he's planning to take 5 questions on each occasion during the campaign. Doesn't necessarily mean every day, but most days he's going to take 5 questions. There will be a draw for who gets to ask. I just got lucky this time, or unlucky, depending on how you see it. And 4 of those will be from people who are on the tour, and 1 more from the local media, at any rate somebody at the choice of the campaign. In other words, if you are likely to ask a friendly question, sounds to me like you might get a better chance at that 5th question. The Prime Minister's staff does have a way of kind of mingling with reporters at the scene to try to get an idea that they can send back to him of who's going to ask what, and we try to keep it secret. So thank you for not asking me what my quintuple-barreled question is going to be when we finally get a chance today. But that's the routine. It was pretty much like that last time. You mentioned that sometimes because of the scene there can be, shall we say, heckling of reporters trying to ask questions. That's because another advantage that the Prime Minister likes to give himself is that he holds these brief and carefully controlled media availabilities, no follow-ups, by the way, in front of his own friendly crowd. So he will typically give a speech in front of a couple of hundred partisans, and they will be listening carefully to any obnoxious questions from uppity reporters, and they will heckle and interfere. Last time I remember, shut down the CBC, they were yelling at me. That's because of the environment. Prime Minister didn't yell, shut down the CBC, but his partisans certainly did. So it can get a little fractious, but that's campaigning, and you just have to ask anyway. And no, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to ask.
All right, and just to underline that point you just made a moment ago, no follow-up. So you ask the question, or another journalist asks the question.
If he doesn't answer it, that's right. If he doesn't answer it, I'm out of luck.
You're out of luck, and you then become dependent. If he's kind of left the thing hanging, either not answering it or left some follow-up question hanging, you're left hoping that one of the other reporters is going to follow up on that, although they too have been sitting there ready with their question.
Well, that's a good point, because we do huddle. the reporters on the bus will typically huddle, and so that we're not all asking the same question unless we need to ask the same question in an effort to get him to answer it more directly. Usually we will huddle and say, okay, we probably got to ask one question about this, one question about that. What do you want to do? And Bloomberg and Reuters may want to ask a business question. How about the dollar, Prime Minister? Everyone's got their particular interest, but generally we arrive at what most editors are going to wish we would have asked, and to make sure that the main issues are covered and not forgotten. Obviously, if you have a huddle with the local reporters only, they may have a local issue about the Champlain Bridge or whatever, and they will go there. But generally speaking, the national reporters do have a pretty good idea of what most people, most of the audience for the newspapers and the television and the radio in both languages will want to hear about. So that is a mechanism that ensures that the Prime Minister can't get away scot-free, that he's going to face the questions which most people are interested in. The problem, as you point out, is that he doesn't have to answer any one of them, because he won't face an objection. He won't face a follow-up from a reporter saying, hey, you didn't answer my question, you're dodging, what about it? That's just not going to happen.
All right, and just a quick follow-up. I'm assuming those 5 are going to be split 2-2 and between English and French, and then the 5th one being luck of the draw? That
will be at the discretion of the campaign. They will decide. It's not going to be 3 and 2. It's going to be basically 4. Maybe they will make sure to include 1 French one, unless they're in Quebec, in which case they'll get more. And the local one will probably be French in any case if they are in Quebec, not if they're not. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about, there's no equality necessarily between English and French, Peter. And by the way, that was a follow-up question. That's not allowed.
Well, let me try one more, just in case. During the normal day on the campaign with Stephen Harper, and we'll check in on what it's like with the other parties as well, but during a normal day, aside from time that's allotted to questions like this, is there any opportunity to challenge the leader, yell out questions, scrum, anything like that?
No, and that's a good point. The problem is that other than that one controlled media avail, dreadful word meaning availability, there is no opportunity. People often ask, I mean, it's a good question, you know, did he say anything on the plane? And the answer usually is, are you kidding? No, he never does say anything on the plane. He does not come back and mingle with reporters. I don't think that's happened since 2005. In which I believe there was one occasion. I could be corrected on that. But generally speaking, there is no access whatsoever outside of that official media availability, and you can shout questions, but you won't get an answer. Generally speaking, you don't even have an opportunity to do that, because the media will be hustled into position. They will be inside a little pen. There'll be ropes and areas where they're not allowed to go. Partisans will be placed in front of the podium. We won't be able to even speak to the partisans some of the time, and then the Prime Minister will be brought in a context where we have no chance to yell a question at him. That's not going to happen either.
All right. Listen, Terry, thanks very much. I know some people may find that a little bit kind of too much navel-gazing on our part, but we want you to understand what the process is like, because quite often we get challenged constantly by viewers and listeners and readers about, you know, why didn't you ask this, why didn't you ask that, why is nobody challenging? This is the situation, as Terry has outlined it, as to what it's like covering, in this particular case, the Harper campaign, based on the Harper campaigns of the past. We will follow closely what happens with the other parties as well. Keep in mind, this is the first election campaign for Tom Mulcair as leader, first for Justin Trudeau as leader. Elizabeth May, the Green Party, has run before as leader, and so, of course, has Gilles Duceppe of the Bloc Québécois. We'll hear from all of them, with the exception of Justin Trudeau, in this next hour or so. We're waiting now for Stephen Harper, who's inside Rideau Hall. We don't know exactly what time he's coming out, but we expect it to be in the next couple of minutes. While we wait, and we will quickly go to it as soon as we see him starting to exit Rideau Hall. Let's bring back in Chantal Hébert and Bruce Anderson from the At Issue panel. And this question of availability for journalists, we're always sensitive about this, that we don't get enough time, we don't get these opportunities. The parties look at these things, obviously, from a different perspective. But what's your take on this whole question of accessibility, Chantal?
Well, there's not going to be a plane for a while for the Prime Minister to come down from the front to the back to. So I suspect that over the next few weeks, availability to Stephen Harper is going to be even more restrained than when there is an actual campaign plane. It's always an issue of balance. I remember that in 1984, the journalists who were covering John Turner, then the Prime Minister, were so incensed over how long had passed since the last time he had answered their questions that they literally blockaded him at the end of an event. I'm not sure that could happen today, because those were the days when there were no ropes to keep the Prime Minister at a very long distance. You also need a stronger voice now to cover federal election campaigns, because the distance has increased. But I think for them, it's a risk and an opportunity. Jean Chrétien would come to the back of the plane. Brian Mulroney did too. Jean Chrétien was always very careful as to what he said there. Brian Mulroney, remember, got in trouble for acting too chummy and saying things on the plane that he was not saying on the campaign trail, and they were kind of black and white. So I think in the end, Mr. Harper's style is based on as much control over the message as possible. That applies to his candidates, and I don't expect him to change in this campaign.
All right. 1980 was another one to remember, too. That was the year Trudeau campaign. It was sort of the first campaign in a bubble tour that we all witnessed, where he rarely came out of that bubble on the campaign. They were leading going in by, I think, 10, 12 points against Joe Clark and the Conservatives in 1980. They didn't want to take any chances. There was no debate in 1980, and very few opportunities to question Pierre Trudeau. So it's somewhat similar to what it's been like covering the Conservatives in terms of accessibility. Bruce, I want to, you talked earlier about numbers, and I want to throw some numbers up on the screen for us, because it's this difference going into the last two campaigns, and whether there's lessons there for us this time around, seeing what we're seeing. So first of all, let me show you the 2008 election campaign scenarios with 77 days to go. So in other words, roughly this time that we're looking for an October 19th election, this is how things kind of changed. The Conservatives went up just under 4 points during that campaign. In 2008, remember, they ended up with a minority government. The Liberals dropped just under 5 points. The NDP went up just over 3 points. And you see what happened to the others. Now look at 2011. This is the campaign that launched the Conservatives into a majority government. They only picked up 2 points in that last 77 days, but that was enough to push them from a minority position to a majority position. The Liberals dropped almost 8 points. The NDP, look at that, they almost doubled their vote, went up to over 30% of the final vote tally, giving them the opposition. The Bloc cratered in Quebec, and the Green Party suffered quite significantly as well. So when you look at those, not a lot of movement in those last 77 days for the Conservatives. Lots of movement for the other two main parties, the NDP and the Liberals. But any lessons there, Bruce, about what we should be thinking about these 77 days, or is everything just so different this time?
Well, there are some important lessons, Peter. I think I'm glad that you put those numbers up, because just looking at them, I think reminds us how much campaigns matter, how much movement can happen. And in the period of time since the last election, we've seen fewer voters express strong attachment to an individual party. In other words, fewer people say, I will only consider voting for this party. If we strip it all away and we say, what's the core vote for each of the three major parties? It's between 10 and 15%. Everything else can tend to be up for grabs. Of course, at the same time right now, we've got almost every news organization and many polling organizations putting out daily forecasts of, if these numbers held on election day, this is who would win the election by how many seats. It's a little bit of a thing that drives me nuts as a pollster, because there's a lot that can happen in a campaign, and there's a lot that can go wrong with those seat projections. I think there's one other thing that I would note that, that speaks to the importance of the campaign is if we look at Tom Mulcair and his trajectory, he's ahead in the polls right now, or at least he's tied with the Conservatives and has improved significantly in the last little while. The main thing that seems to have happened to cause that is a combination of the NDP winning the provincial election in Alberta and the Conservatives throwing tons of advertising against Justin Trudeau. When we think about that, it does make sense to imagine that Tom Mulcair is going to come under an awful lot of scrutiny in the next several weeks. How he handles that is either going to tell the tale of his trajectory going forward in a positive way for him, or he's going to see some setbacks. So I think there's a lot of volatility ahead in these numbers. At least that's what we should assume. And the last thing, Peter, is we've become accustomed to the notion of turnouts kind of in a narrow and not very good range from the standpoint of what it says about our democracy. This election is not going to sneak up on voters. We're going to be all aware of it by the time that it happens. And whether that means that more people are going to turn out is something significant to watch. You finished your question by talking about whether the Conservatives have a lot of room to grow. Based on past elections and current polling, they don't appear to have a lot of room to grow. So if turnout does improve, that could be something that works for the parties that are arguing for change.
All right, Bruce and Chantal with us as we await the Prime Minister coming out of Rideau Hall to call the election. So we'll be back to Bruce and Chantal after we've heard those statements. That's the scene at Rideau Hall, where the Prime Minister is meeting with the Governor-General behind those closed doors. Momentarily, they will open. The Prime Minister will come out, make a statement about the calling of the election for October 19th, perhaps give within that statement some reasoning behind why this has to be such a long campaign. That'll be the public explanation. We've heard all the different strategic ones. It's hard to imagine that he's going to use some of those strategic reasons in a public fashion to talk about why he's calling it, because most of those strategic reasons are about how much money the Conservatives have compared to everyone else to campaign. Also, looking across the river from Ottawa, across the Ottawa River to Gatineau, this is where Tom Mulcair will be speaking. Some members of his party testing out the mics to make sure everything is okay. He will be making a statement, and we assume answering questions with that spectacular backdrop of Parliament Hill across the river on what looks like a quite gorgeous day in the nation's capital. Also, we will have the Green Party. Elizabeth May, the leader, will be speaking at this location in British Columbia, where the Green Party leader will outline her position and perhaps answer some questions. We'll catch at least a part of that session as well. And finally, in Quebec, Bloc leader Gilles Duceppe will be speaking from this podium. And Gilles Duceppe, no stranger to federal elections. He's had more than a few. In fact, this is his 7th election as leader of the Bloc Québécois. You remember his party did very poorly last time round, and he stepped down from that position. So we're seeing some movement now from the officials inside the Rideau Hall as the Prime Minister's officials bring out his statement, put it on the podium. The doors are opening. And so we expect to see the Prime Minister, who this will be his 5th election as a leader. That's right, 5th. He lost one, won 3, and this is number 5. We'll see what happens on that one. Of those 3 wins, 2 minorities, and the last is a majority. Here's Stephen Harper heading towards the microphone to explain why we're going to a 77-day campaign for an October 19th election. Let's listen in.
Bon matin, good morning. Il y a quelques minutes, j'ai rencontré son Excellence le gouverneur général
the Governor-General and asked him to dissolve Parliament and to hold an election on the fixed date set according to the legislation. And
des chefs des autres partis.
We will be beginning our
C'est important
campaign
que ces campagnes
activity.
soient financées par les partis eux-mêmes.
That campaign will be funded by the parties
Il
themselves,
est aussi approprié que les Canadiens
and
et les
it
Canadiennes
is also
aient le
appropriate
temps de considérer les choix
for Canadians
qui
to
leur sont
consider the choices
Parce que
being
ces
offered to them.
élections sont une question de leadership
Because
sur
elections are
les
all about
enjeux
leadership
importants, des enjeux qui nous touchent tous,
and about the
notre
issues
économie
that
et
affect
la
all of us.
sécurité
The
de notre
economy,
pays.
our
Ces élections
security,
vont déterminer qui va
and the
protéger
environment.
notre économie dans une période d'instabilité économique continue
This is
et qui va
an
assurer
ongoing
la
period of
prospérité
economic
future
instability.
du Canada. Et ces élections vont
And this
déterminer qui est
election
mieux placé pour prendre des
will
décisions
determine
difficiles
who is in the best
afin
position
d'assurer la sécurité
to
de
make
notre
the
pays.
right decisions to
Une élection
ensure the safety and
nationale
security
n'est
of
pas
this
un
country.
concours de popularité.
This is not a popularity
Les Canadiennes et les
contest.
Canadiens vont faire un choix sérieux
Canadians
entre
will be
une
making a
expérience
serious
concrète
choice
qui a fait ses preuves et une approche
between
dangereuse
a
qui a
government
déjà
that has proven
échoué
itself
et qui échoue dans
and
d'autres pays.
dangerous
Aujourd'hui, comme les
positions.
Canadiens et les Canadiennes le savent,
As
l'économie
Canadians
mondiale
know,
reste incertaine et
the
instable.
economy remains
La crise de la
unstable
dette en
and
Europe
uncertain.
se poursuit. La Chine traverse un important
China
ralentissement économique.
is going
La
through
reprise
a difficult
économique aux
economic
États-Unis reste plus
period,
lente que prévu.
and growth in the United
Une
States
fois
remains
encore,
slower than
ces
expected.
événements à l'étranger ont un impact ici au pays.
Events abroad
Le
do
Canada
have an
continue à
effect
afficher
here
une
in
bonne
Canada.
performance comparativement aux autres pays du G7,
But
mais nous
compared to
devons
other
rester
G7 countries,
concentrés et maintenir le cap.
we are
La
able
gestion
to
de
stay
notre
the course
économie
here in
reste la
Canada.
priorité première de notre gouvernement.
That will be
Nos choix sont
this
prudents
government's top
et nos
priority.
actions sont disciplinées. Et
We will
c'est
take
pourquoi
disciplined
notre
action.
économie et nos emplois continuent à croître de façon soutenue
Jobs
depuis
and the job
6
market
ans.
are continuing to
Notre
grow.
budget est équilibré, nos
Our budget is balanced,
sociaux sont protégés. Et nous
and
réduisons les taxes et les impôts des
country
Canadiens et des Canadiennes
is
qui
protected.
travaillent fort et offrant de nouvelles prestations importantes directement
And some
aux familles.
new benefits
Ce
are
n'est pas le
now
moment
being made
pour
available
le
to
genre
families.
de plans risqués qui causent
This is no
tant de
time for
dommages
risky
ailleurs
plans
dans le monde.
that could
Et ce n'est
harm our
certainement
future.
Le moment pour les impôts plus élevés, des
This is no
dépenses
time for higher
irresponsables
taxes
et des déficits permanents.
and
C'est le
permanent
moment de
deficits.
maintenir le cap. C'est
It's
le
time
moment
to stay
de
the course
nous en tenir à notre plan.
and to stick
Ces
to our
élections
plan.
sont aussi axées sur notre sécurité, et pas seulement notre
The issue is
sécurité
also
contre
our
les risques habituels
security,
du comportement criminel, mais notre
including
sécurité
criminal
contre les
behavior.
menaces grandissantes dans un monde de plus en
There
plus
are increasing
dangereux.
risks
La montée du
in an
soi-disant
ever
État
dangerous world.
islamique au Moyen-Orient fait plus
ISIS
que simplement
in
créer
the
une
Middle
crise
East
urgente et horrible. Dans
is
cette partie
carrying
du
out
monde, elle alimente
terrible
également
acts,
le violent mouvement
and that
djihadiste
is
mondial
fostering
qui pose une menace
violence
directe pour nos amis
that
et
represents a
alliés et pour
direct
nous ici au
threat
pays.
to us in
Les
Canada
terroristes
and to our
djihadistes ont
allies.
clairement déclaré la guerre au Canada et aux
ISIS
Canadiens.
has
Et en octobre
declared war on
dernier,
Canada.
des attaques violentes ont été
And
commises ici, chez nous.
We have seen the
Et en
impact
Europe,
of violent
l'invasion
acts
de
here in
l'Ukraine par
Canada.
Vladimir Poutine et l'agression militaire constante continuent à
Constant
menacer la paix et la
military
stabilité gagnée
aggression
à un coût très cher par les
is
générations
very
précédentes.
costly and can be very
Notre
costly for
gouvernement
future
prend des
generations.
décisions
Our
décisives
government
en
is
réponse
making
à
the
ces
difficult
menaces.
decisions,
Nous renforçons nos lois pour donner aux
strengthening
organismes de sécurité et des
our
forces
laws to
policières
ensure the
les
safety and
outils
security of
modernes
this country.
dont ils ont besoin pour assurer notre sécurité. Nous faisons partie
And
de l'importante coalition
we
militaire
are part
internationale
of
dirigée
an
par le
important
président
international
Obama
military
contre l'État islamique.
coalition
Chaque
against
jour,
ISIS.
les hommes et les femmes de forces armées
Every day,
canadiennes font notre
men and women
fierté en
from our
combattant
Canadian
les terroristes
armed
qui nous
forces are
veulent
combating
mal. Et notre
terrorism.
gouvernement est au premier plan
And our
de la réponse
government
internationale
is in the
contre
forefront
l'agression russe et
of
pour le droit
international
des pays pacifiques et démocratiques
efforts
comme l'Ukraine de
to
choisir
ensure
leur propre
that
avenir.
Russia can end its aggression.
Aujourd'hui, le Canada prenne position sur la
Today,
scène internationale pour défendre la
is
liberté,
taking a
la
position
paix et la
to
dignité
defend
humaine.
peace
Ce n'est pas le
and
moment
freedom.
de la rectitude politique, de la
It's not
gouvernance inexpérimentée
a matter
ou de refus
of choosing
idéologique
inexperienced
d'agir.
governance
C'est le moment
or political
d'affronter
correctness.
ce qui nous menace
Now
avec une
is the
clarté
time to
morale,
face
avec
what
force
is threatening
et
us
détermination.
with strength and determination.
Ici au Canada,
Here in
nous
Canada,
avons la chance de vivre dans le
we
meilleur pays du monde.
are lucky to live in the
Dans
best
moins
country
de
in the
2 ans,
world.
nous allons célébrer le 150e
We will soon be
anniversaire
celebrating
de la
the
naissance du
150th
Canada en tant que pays uni.
anniversary
Mais
of
avant
Canada
ce moment
and
marquant de
Confederation.
notre histoire, les
At this
Canadiens
time in
et
our
les
history,
Canadiennes vont prendre une décision critique
Canadians
sur
will need
l'orientation
to
de
make
notre
a
pays.
critical decision
Une
about the
décision
future of
avec
this
des vraies
country,
conséquences.
a
Une
decision
décision
that is fraught with
celui qui a
consequences
l'expérience, qui a fait ses preuves aujourd'hui
and
pour assurer la force de notre
we
économie
need
et la sécurité de notre
proven
pays.
experience to ensure
Je vais demander aux Canadiens et aux
the
Canadiennes
safety and
leur
security
soutien
of this country.
pour continuer
I am
à faire
asking
une solide
Canadians
gestion économique
for their
et pour
support,
prendre des décisions difficiles nécessaires
sound
afin de
economic
protéger la sécurité
performance,
de notre
and
pays.
to protect the safety and
Au cours des
security of this
prochaines
country.
semaines, je vais
In the coming
rencontrer les
weeks,
Canadiens et les Canadiennes
I will
aux
be
4
meeting
coins du pays,
with
alors que
Canadians
nous
all
présenterons
across
les
the country
prochaines étapes de notre plan.
and telling them
Once
about our
again,
plan.
a few moments ago, I met with His Excellency the Governor General, and he has agreed to my request that Parliament be dissolved. In accordance with our commitment to a fixed election date, the next general election will be held as prescribed by law. As it is my intention to begin campaign-related activities, and it's also the case for the other party leaders, it's important that these campaigns be funded by the parties themselves rather than taxpayers. It's also appropriate that Canadians have the time to consider the alternatives before them, because this is an election about leadership on the big issues that affect us all, our economy and our nation's security. It's an election about who will protect our economy in a period of ongoing global instability and secure Canada's future prosperity. And it is an election about who is best equipped to make the tough calls to keep our country safe. A national election is not a popularity contest. On October the 19th, Canadians will make a serious choice between proven real-world experience and a dangerous approach that has failed before and is failing in other countries. Today, as Canadians know, the global economy remains uncertain and unstable. The debt crisis in Europe continues to unfold. China is experiencing a significant economic downturn. Economic recovery in the U.S. continues to be slower than anticipated. These events abroad are once again impacting us here at home. Canada has continued to perform well compared to other G7 countries, but we cannot forget our focus or lose our course. Managing our economy remains our government's top priority. Our choices have been prudent and our actions have been disciplined. As a result, our economy and our employment have grown steadily over 6 years. Our budget is balanced, our social programs have been preserved, and we have lowered taxes for hard-working Canadians and delivered significant new benefits directly to Canadian families. Now is not the time for the kind of risky economic schemes that are doing so much damage elsewhere in the world. Now is most certainly not the time for higher taxes, reckless spending, and permanent deficits. Now is the time to stay on track. Now is the time to stick to our plan. This election is also about security, not merely our security against the normal risks of criminal behavior, but our security against the growing threats of an increasingly dangerous world. The rise of the so-called Islamic State in the Middle East has done more than just create an urgent and horrific crisis in that part of the world. It has also fueled the violent global jihadist movement that poses a direct threat to our friends and allies and to us here at home. Jihadist terrorists have declared war on Canada and Canadians by name, and last October, violent attacks were carried out on our soil. Meanwhile, in Europe, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and ongoing military aggression continue to threaten the peace and stability won at great price by previous generations. Our government has taken decisive action in response to these threats. We've strengthened our legislation to give our security and law enforcement agencies the modern tools necessary to keep us safe. We are part of the broad international military coalition led by President Obama against the Islamic State. And day in and day out, the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces do us proud by taking the fight to the terrorists who seek to harm us. And our government has been out front in the world's response against Russian aggression and for the right of peaceful and democratic countries like Ukraine to choose their own future. I'm proud that today Canada takes stands in the world in defense of freedom, peace, and human dignity. Now is not the time for political correctness, inexperienced governance, or an ideological unwillingness to act. Now is the time to face those who threaten us with moral clarity, strength, and resolve. We Canadians are truly blessed to live in the best country in the world. In less than 2 years, we will celebrate the 150th anniversary of Canada's birth as a united country. But before this significant moment in our history, Canadians will make a critical decision about the direction of our country, a decision with real consequences, a decision about who has the proven experience today to keep our economy strong and our country safe. I will be asking Canadians for their support to continue to deliver sound economic management and to take the difficult decisions necessary to protect our country's security. Over the coming weeks, I look forward to meeting Canadians from coast to coast to coast as we lay out the next steps in our plan.
And with that, the Prime Minister will take questions from the media. When I call your name, please make your way to the microphone on my left. On va commencer avec Terry Milewski, CBC, please.
Prime Minister, good morning. You just said that you thought that the parties should pay for the campaign, not taxpayers. And a lot of voters are bound to find that a very odd statement, considering that you have just loaded tens of millions of dollars of additional costs on taxpayers by deciding to have a much longer campaign in which, not coincidentally, you will have a chance to spend far more than your rivals. Taxpayers will have to subsidize the parties, the candidates, and they'll have to pay more for Elections Canada. Why should voters not conclude that you're giving yourself a financial edge because maybe you think that's the only way you can win?
Well, first of all, I'll go back and say what I just said. The reality is this, Terry. Everybody knows the election date, and the campaigns of the other parties, as near as I can tell, have already begun. I'm beginning our campaign today. I feel very strongly that if we're going to begin our campaigns and going to run our campaigns, that those campaigns need to be conducted under the rules of the law, that the money come from the parties themselves, not from the government resources, parliamentary resources, or taxpayer resources, and that's what we're doing. In terms of the advantages this party has, in terms of the fact that we are a better financed political party, a better organized political party, and better supported by Canadians, those advantages exist whether we call this campaign or not. What we do by calling this campaign is making sure we are all operating within the rules and not using taxpayers' money directly.
Merci. On continue avec Denis Ferland, RDI.
Bonjour, Monsieur Harper. Monsieur Harper, quand vous avez présenté la loi sur les élections à date fixe à Victoria en
when you
mai,
introduced
en
fixed date
2006, vous disiez que vous
election
vouliez mettre fin à la pratique des premiers ministres qui manipulent le
you
calendrier
said you
électoral
wanted
à
to
leur
put an
avantage
end
politique.
to
Êtes-vous en train
prime
de nous dire qu'il n'y a
ministers
aucun avantage
manipulating
pour vous,
election
à
dates?
lancer cette élection-là quand même plus de deux fois, une campagne 2 fois plus longue finalement?
This is a campaign that will be twice as long.
Tout à fait au contraire.
That has an advantage for you. Well, the fact is that all the political parties were already aware of the election date.
C'est essentiel, nous commençons maintenant, nous commençons notre campagne.
It is essential that we launch our campaign now, that all the political parties abide by the rules under the legislation, and that they not use government or parliamentary resources. In terms of the advantages for our party, the fact that our party is better financed, is better organized and has more support from Canadians than other parties, well, we would have those advantages anyway. And if we're going to run a campaign like the other parties, we have to follow the rules. And we all know the date of the election.
Jordan Press from the Canadian Press, please.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Just a second ago, you talked about sound economic management. Your opponents have basically made this a little bit about change in this campaign and said that it's time for a change because your plan isn't working given the economic indicators we've seen over the past couple of weeks. Why should Canadians continue to trust your plan for the economy? And as well, what is specifically in that plan that you're going to promise to Canadians that would actually turn around what we've seen in a shrinking economy?
I think our plan has proven itself over a long number of years now. Canada has consistently, not every month, not every week, but over a period of 6 years now, we have consistently outperformed other major industrial economies. We have a balanced budget. Most of them don't. We have the lowest debt levels by far. We have the soundest financial system. We are not cutting our budgets. We are making investments in critical things like trade and training and innovation and infrastructure. And that is why, you look at all the major forecasters, all the major international agencies, they all predict that Canada's growth prospects are the best of G7 countries over the long haul. Now look, the change that is being proposed, let's be clear what the change is that's being proposed. We have given Canadians a low tax plan with disciplined financial management. What the other guys are proposing is a high tax plan, hikes in, big hikes in spending to lead to permanent deficits as a way of dealing with temporary economic challenges. That is a formula that has been disastrous in other countries. It's why they don't perform over the long haul as well as Canada, and we will contrast our low tax plan focused on jobs and growth with their high tax plan focused on simply growing the size of government.
Thank you. We'll continue with Lori Graham from CTV.
Prime Minister, I understand you say you want to save taxpayers' money. You want all of the leaders under the same rules of Elections Canada. But by triggering this election, a 78-day campaign, the fact of the matter is the cost of this election campaign goes up exponentially, and taxpayers are indeed on the hook for more money. So how do you square a 78-day campaign that is at least 50% more than a 37-day campaign?
Well, I would challenge the premise of the question, but I would say this. It is important, once again, as I say, that every political party's campaign be financed by itself, not government resources, not parliamentary resources, not of all the other resources that are available to us when campaigns are not on. Everybody is campaigning, everybody should finance their own campaign, and everybody should operate under the law and the rules for campaigns. And I don't think it is appropriate at all that campaigns be done all outside the campaign rules. And look, I think if I started my campaign without declaring it, I think everybody here would be the first to criticize us for doing that. We are taking what is the appropriate and the right thing to do.
Merci. On va terminer avec Ray Filion, TVA.
Bonjour, M. Harper. Deux questions. Une sur l'économie d'abord. Vous vous présentez comme le meilleur gestionnaire de l'économie hors de pouvoir. 7 ans sur 9, le gouvernement ont fait des déficits. Vous avez ajouté des milliards de dollars.
You have had deficits in the past.
Un déficit cette année, selon le directeur parlementaire.
And there is going to be a deficit this year, according to the parliamentary budget officer. And what about the cost of this election? Do you recognize that you are calling an election that will cost the taxpayers much more money? The reality is that Canada already has a balanced budget. And there was a surplus in the first few months, and our results are even better now. We have the lowest debt of any of the G7 countries.
Nous avons, pendant une grande période, une performance supérieure
for a very long period, our economic performance, economic growth was far better than any of the G7 countries. And the international organizations are saying that with our economic plan, that will continue to be the case. So the choice is clear. A government that lowers taxes for families and Canadians and disciplined economic management. Or a political approach that means higher taxes and bigger government. That's the choice. But our choice is working well, and we can see the results of such policies in other countries. In terms of this election, the election campaign has already begun. The other parties have already begun their campaign. And I think it's critical that political parties fund their own campaigns, not using government sources or parliamentary sources, but their own funds. And if I were to begin my campaign without triggering an election, that would be inappropriate. So I think that we have to all play by the rules and use our own funds and respect the law that's in place.
All right, Stephen Harper announcing the election for October 19th after meeting with the Governor General and then giving a statement, first in French, then in English, and then answering a series of 5 questions. Lots to talk about there in the few minutes we've got before Tom Mulcair will take the stand across the river in Gatineau, Quebec, to make his opening statement of this election campaign. 2 things, and one is a little tricky. It seemed in Stephen Harper's statement in French, he said something that he did not then say in English, which appeared to be a literal translation of one to the other, but there was something different in French and in English, and certainly through the translation it was different, and we're waiting for the official record. In the French version of his statement, the Prime Minister said there'll be 3 key issues that they'll be hitting on: the economy, our security, and the environment. Now, in English, he did not say the environment. He just said the economy and our security. So we're trying to get clarification on that. Why, if in fact that is what happened, there is a different message to one part of the country than to another. Now, the second part is, and I got to admit, and I want to bring Terry Milewski in on this conversation now because he asked the question, the lead question, about costs. I got to say, I'm puzzled. I'm still confused here about what's public costs and what isn't. The Prime Minister seeming to say that only the parties are going to cover the bill for this election, but as you pointed out and others have pointed out, that's actually not the way it works. So what are we supposed to, what's the takeaway here?
Well, that's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer. A lot of people here, frankly, Peter, are shaking their heads considering that this rather bizarre statement by the Prime Minister, he seems to have stuck with it throughout this brief press conference. Essentially, what he has told us is that he's doing this early campaign call because he wants to make sure that the parties, not the taxpayers, pay for the campaign. And of course, that's not going to happen. Everyone here understands that 50 cents on the dollar of what the parties spend and 60 cents on the dollar of what the candidates spend and 100 cents on the dollar of what Elections Canada spends on a longer campaign is reimbursed directly, not indirectly, it is directly reimbursed by the taxpayer. The taxpayer underwrites Elections Canada. The taxpayer sends that money to the campaigns. The taxpayer sends that money directly to the parties as a federal rebate for every dollar they spend during the campaign. So I think the Prime Minister, while he has certainly delivered well-rehearsed lines on the economy and security and may do well on those issues with many voters, on this issue, which he obviously knew he was going to be asked about, this rather unusual, well, very unusual, indeed unprecedentedly long campaign, frankly, the answers don't make any sense, and that's why we're all left wondering about the question you just asked. Can we make sense of it? The answer is no, we can't.
All right. Obviously, the spinners are going to be out very quickly trying to put some background to the Prime Minister's remarks. We'll obviously find out. Thanks, Terry. Terry Malefsky outside Rideau Hall. Let's switch over to Rosie Barton, who was also watching all that unfold. And Rosie, aside from those 2 points that we've mentioned, including that strange difference of the French and the English on the word environment, the main thrust of the speech, or the attempted main thrust, doesn't appear to be being reported that way at the moment, though, was underlined by the 4-letter word risk, that the Conservatives trying to say it is too risky, too much risk involved in going with anybody other than them on the economy or security. That clearly seems to be what they hope the message is.
Right, and that's sort of been what we've expected the theme to be for some time. So they're saying strong economy and a safer country, or sort of the 2 taglines there that I came away with. But there are problems with at least the first half of that, right? We've been talking a lot about the economy over the past number of months, and you heard the Prime Minister said that the economy in Canada has grown steadily over 6 years. Well, in fact, that's not really the case. We just got the gross domestic product numbers from May showing that the GDP is down again in this country. There are those that believe that by the time we get into September and we see the first 2 quarters of this country, we will have seen overall shrinkage, which is, of course, the technical definition of a recession. So, you know, yes, you can go out and say that you've made the right choices for the economy, but then when you then compare it to the things that are actually happening, some reductions in the GDP, a trade deficit, and other problems, how do you defend that? You know, one of the things I think that people will keep an eye on are job numbers over the course of the next couple of months as well, because those are things sort of that hit closer to home in ways, right? You know, the GDP shrinking, okay, well, that's not great news. But if people are losing their jobs, if there's problems in the oil patch, if people are making layoffs, and the Prime Minister, the Conservative leader, is claiming that they are the strongest managers of the economy and that the other guys are a risk, this could become problematic for them, because perhaps the economy is not doing as well as it should right now. Right. And maybe Canadians will think that's a risk worth taking. All right,
Rosie, look, thank you. Giving you the quick out here because we've got Tom Mulcair heading towards his position, which once again is just across the river from Parliament Hill on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River. Keep in mind, most of the NDP seats are in Quebec. Tom Mulcair, his first run as leader of the NDP in the election. Here's his statement.
Good morning. In this election campaign, Canadians have a clear choice. 4 more years of Mr. Harper and the Conservatives, or my plan for change. Traveling across Canada over the past weeks and months with Catherine, I've heard the calls for change grow louder. And it isn't difficult to see why. Wages are falling, incomes are stagnant, and household debt is skyrocketing. Middle-class families are working harder than ever, but can't get ahead. Mr. Harper has the worst economic growth record of any Prime Minister since 1960. The economy has shrunk in each of the last 5 months, and many are claiming that Canada is already in another recession. Clearly, Mr. Harper, your plan isn't working. I want to speak to every Canadian who thinks Mr. Harper's government is on the wrong track. To every Canadian who is looking for change in Ottawa. Our plan is built on enduring Canadian values. hard work, living within your means, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to focus the government's priorities on helping you get ahead. Partout où Catherine et moi allons, les Canadiens nous
Everywhere
disent
where
qu'ils souhaitent
Catherine and I
du changement.
go, Canadians
Que
say
ce
they want
soit à
change.
Montréal ou à
Whether it's in
Moncton,
Montreal
à
or
Lévis
in
ou à
Moncton,
Winnipeg,
in Lévis or
les
Winnipeg,
Canadiens envoient tous
Canadians
un même message.
are all giving
Après
us the
10 ans de
same
Stephen Harper
message.
à Ottawa,
After 10 years
ils
of
veulent
Stephen
tourner la
Harper in
page.
Ottawa, they want to
Parce
turn
que
the
le
page.
plan de Stephen Harper ne
Because
fonctionne
Stephen
tout
Harper's
simplement
plan simply isn't
Les
working.
conservateurs laissent aux générations futures
Conservatives
une énorme dette
are leaving a huge
économique,
economic
sociale
debt to future
et écologique.
generations. Economic,
L'endettement des
ecological,
familles atteint
and social.
un niveau record.
Household debt levels are reaching
Il y
record
a
levels.
200 000 personnes
And
sans
there are
emploi
200,000
de plus
people
aujourd'hui
more
qu'avant la
without
crise
jobs
de
today
2008.
than before the
Les quelques
2008
emplois qui
crisis.
sont disponibles
The few
sont
jobs that
soit
are
précaires,
available are
soit à temps
either
partiel,
precarious or
souvent les deux.
part-time, and
Les
often
Canadiens
both.
souhaitent remplacer la vision
Canadians
étroite des
want
conservateurs
to
par une
replace
vision claire
the narrow
et un projet de
conservative
société
vision
axé
by
autour
a clear
du
vision,
développement durable.
one
Les gens
that is
que
focuses
je rencontre
on
partout
sustainable
au Canada
development.
souhaitent
The people
remplacer
that
la
I meet with
politique
all over
de
Canada
peur
want to
et de
replace the
division des
politics of
conservateurs
fear and
par une
division that we
politique
see with the conservatives.
d'espoir
Replace
et
that
d'optimisme.
with politics of hope and optimism.
I believe that governing is about priorities. Mr. Harper's priority is to spend millions of dollars on self-serving government advertising and an early election call. My priority is to invest in affordable quality childcare to help families and the economy. Mr. Harper's priority is to gut laws that protect our air and water while harming our reputation around the world. My priority is to strengthen and enforce environmental rules here at home and have Canada do its part in tackling climate change on the world stage. Mr. Harper's priority has been to spend $100 million a year fighting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in court. My priority is to build a respectful nation-to-nation relationship with our First Peoples that recognizes inherent rights and brings us closer to reconciliation. While Mr. Harper sits on the sidelines, Canada has lost hundreds of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs. My priority is to actively champion our manufacturing sectors and attract new investment to create good-paying, full-time jobs. But it's not just Mr. Harper's misplaced priorities. Do you remember when Mr. Harper promised to responsibly manage the country's finances? He's had 8 deficits in a row and has added over $150 billion in debt. Do you remember when Mr. Harper promised to clean up liberal corruption? In each of the last 3 elections, Conservatives have been convicted of wrongdoing. Some have been sent to jail. 1/3 of the Senate is under RCMP investigation. I believe this must change once and for all. Do you remember when Mr. Harper promised to build a strong economy and create jobs? Recent reports show that Mr. Harper has the worst job creation record of any prime minister since the Second World War. And today, there are 200,000 more out-of-work Canadians than before the last recession in 2008. We will kickstart the economy and get Canadians back to work. This is our #1 priority. Mettre l'économie sur les rails.
We will put the economy back on track and create quality jobs that are well paid and offer our young people every opportunity to succeed, as well as guaranteeing that seniors have a dignified retirement and the services they need, building a more open, democratic country, and improving the reputation of this country around the world.
My values stem from my upbringing. My family story is that of millions of Canadian families. I was the second oldest of 10 kids. We had to work for everything we had. It wasn't easy. We worked hard, played by the rules, and lived within our means. We learned the importance of looking out for one another, of sticking together, of backing up your principles with action. These are the values that guide me as a husband as a father, and as a grandfather. These values have guided my 35 years of public service, including as a cabinet minister. These are the values that will guide me in the future. Je comprends personnellement la réalité.
I personally understand the reality of middle-class families. I grew up in a family of 10 children in Laval, and I learned there about the importance of solidarity, of helping one another and working hard. And I applied those values throughout my career. As the minister in the Quebec government, I had difficult choices to make, but I learned to prudently manage the environment in the interests of the public, and I acquired the necessary experience to replace Stephen Harper.
My whole life. And I believe that together, we can leave to future generations a strong, united Canada that is more prosperous, more fair, and that stands tall on the world stage. Our offer to Canadians is clear. A government that stands up for middle-class families and the communities where they live. A government that grows the economy and creates stable, full-time jobs while protecting the environment. One that ensures young people get the opportunities they need and our seniors get the benefits they deserve.
As you saw, in the last 4 years, the NDP has a solid team. The NDP is ready to form a government that reflects your values and brings you together, because it's time to elect a government that will be serving all Canadians, a government that will help the middle class to make ends meet. Canadians deserve a Prime Minister who will set aside partisanship, a Prime Minister who will work to grow the economy while protecting the environment. Canadians deserve a Prime Minister who has the experience and the necessary leadership to repair the damage caused by Stephen Harper.
We will build a Canada where democratic traditions are respected at home and our reputation as a country is respected abroad, where we replace fear and division with hope and optimism. A Canada where everyone belongs and no one is left behind. That's the Canada we can build together. Canadians are ready for change, and we're ready too. I invite you to join us. Thank you. Merci.
And there you go, Tom Mulcair, the NDP leader, with his opening statement. And you see him now walking away from the podium. And why is he walking away? No questions. We spent a good amount of time before the Harper appearance at Rideau Hall talking about the debate around questions, how many there would be asked, whether there would be any asked. Well, in this particular case, for Tom Mulcair, he's decided against taking any questions. We talked after Stephen Harper's statement about the key word in his speech, and it was all about risk. Too risky to go elsewhere on the economy or on security issues. What was the key word in Tom Mulcair's speech today, his opening statement of the campaign? Change. I can offer change, says the NDP leader, to what you've been seeing from the Conservatives in terms of both the management of the economy, on the issues of accountability. He didn't talk about security. You never heard the word ISIS, or at least I didn't hear the word ISIS come up at all in his statement. Let's try and get some early reaction to this. There's nobody a part of our team who's covered Tom Mulcair more than the host of Power and Politics, and that's Rosie Barton, because Rosie used to be covering the National Assembly in Quebec when Tom Mulcair was a member of the Quebec Liberal Party and a cabinet minister for the Quebec Liberals. She's now watching him closely as the NDP leader. Rosie, a couple of points there. First of all, the no questions. What's their reasoning behind that?
It's unusual for him, definitely unusual. I think the NDP would say to you, listen, he was out for 10 days last week. He did lots of media. He took lots of questions. You know, he's talked to media a lot in the past 2 weeks. I think probably the real assessment of what is happening is he wants to just let Stephen Harper wear this day. He wants to let him explain why he called the election, why it has to be so long, what's going on with the economy, and he wants to come out clean out of the blocks, if you will. Get his message out there, and you're right, I'll have you send me 2 of those little flashcards that you've made up already, so I can just keep them in my brain. He just wants to talk about change. And the other thing that he didn't talk about, or the name that didn't cross his lips during that speech, speech was Justin Trudeau. In their mind, there's no reason to mention the Liberal leader. They mentioned the Liberals writ large, but not the specifics of the Liberal leader. They're not going to mention him because they don't want the job that he has. They want the job that this guy has. So it was all about directing the attack between him and Stephen Harper. Here are my priorities. Here are Stephen Harper's priorities. And yes, I think Canadians want change, so I want to personify that change. So, I mean, it is exactly what you just put up on your flashcards. It is going to be about that. I think what's at issue here is who personifies change, right? The Liberals are hoping it's still maybe their guy. The Bloc, the Greens, are all hoping they can get in on that wave. And Stephen Harper has to try and paint everyone as just too risky to consider.
All right. Thanks, Rosie. Rosie Barton outside Rideau Hall. Keep in mind there won't be a flashcard, at least for this morning, on Justin Trudeau because we won't be hearing from him. He's on a plane heading to the West Coast where his event will be later this afternoon. So he misses the sort of time spot in terms of the election call this morning by making a commitment to attend the Pride Vancouver parade in Vancouver later on today. Terry Milewski was listening in on all this too, our senior correspondent out of Ottawa. Terry, on Tom Mulcair, what'd you make of it?
Well, it's very interesting Rose Garden strategy. You remember the Rose Garden, obviously an American term, whereby the Rose Garden strategy refers to when you're ahead, don't mess up. Just stay in the Rose Garden, make statements, don't take questions, don't rock the boat, don't take risks. Mr. Mulcair is basically sending a discreet message here that he thinks he's the front runner, that he thinks he's the one that just has to not make a mistake in order to get elected. That may or may not be true, but he's certainly saying that by walking away from questions. Remember that although if you look at the polls, you can organize, you can see how the Conservatives might come out slightly ahead in the seat count, but still far away from a majority. But Mr. Mulcair still is a point or two ahead in most of the polls. If you average them out, he's almost exactly 1% ahead of the polls. So obviously the NDP has decided we're going to play this very carefully. And the other thing that I found interesting was, as you noted, Peter, nothing about security and ISIS in here. His speech is all about what he thinks are the kitchen sink issues which more voters care about. The economy. Mr. Harper, it's clear that your plan is not working. He is going to bang away on that drum, I guarantee it, for the next 77 days, in which he will say that Canada is heading into a recession, that Mr. Harper's economic plan has left the middle class behind, and so forth. I won't recite it because you're going to hear it every day. Now, on the one other point, and that is the security omission. The omission of security could turn out to be a problem. Imagine if there is some sort of incident which focuses attention on the Prime Minister's agenda. At the moment, the war against ISIS is very far away. Perhaps many Canadians are not thinking about it, although Mr. Harper emphasized the sacrifice made by our armed forces in his opening remarks. Mr. Mulcair stayed away from that. Maybe he's calculating that people aren't thinking about that. They're really thinking about the cost of childcare, kitchen sink issues, as I say. Well, we'll see about that. A lot can happen in 78 days.
Sure can. All right, Terry, thanks very much. Terry outside Rideau Hall. Talk about deja vu all over again. It is for Gilles Duceppe of the Bloc Québécois, left the race, or left politics after the 2011 election, after the Bloc was basically decimated in Quebec. He's making a comeback, or trying to make a comeback, as leader of the BQ. In Montreal today, he has these opening remarks. Let's join his statement in progress.
The Bloc Québécois is not going to be playing Stephen Harper's little game. Before we get into the debates, the Bloc candidates, some of whom are with me now, and myself, intend to continue to visit the regions of Quebec. We're going to meet with Quebecers without forcing up the pace. And I will be talking to you directly wherever you are. I consider myself to be lucky to be able to visit the regions of Quebec in the summer. It's a lot easier to do that in summer than it is in winter. And since I returned, my greatest pleasure has been talking to you and hearing about your reality, about our reality. before we hear more commitments and proposals, we want to hear from you. That's the way the Bloc is going to be listening to Quebecers. And one of the aspects that struck me the most since I returned is the number of young people who have joined the Bloc. They're optimistic, they're positive, and they're full of energy. And I want to help those young people to play their role. In fact, it's all of Quebec that has to make room for youth, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing in the Bloc Québécois. They're there, and we're going to take advantage of their presence. Another thing that struck me is the absence of Quebec in the debates in Ottawa. In fact, the word Quebec wasn't mentioned at all in either of those two speeches. We pay taxes, but
all right, Bloc Quebec wall leader Gilles Duceppe making his pitch, and keep in mind he only runs candidates in the province of Quebec, nowhere else in the country. Obviously, it's why they call it the Bloc Québécois. And the leader making his points there now, saying that neither of the other leaders so far even mentioned the province of Quebec in their opening statements. He is directing his campaign solely at them, trying to make a comeback. They only had 2 seats, I think, when Parliament was dissolved, the Bloc, and they used to, and there was a point at which, not that long ago, they were in fact the official opposition in Canada. They scored so many seats in the province of Quebec. All right, time before we hear from the Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, to bring the at-issue gang back in, Chantal Hébert and Bruce Anderson. And obviously I want to hear what you have to say about Harper and Mulcair, but Chantal, very briefly, in terms of Gilles Duceppe, how much of a factor does it appear that he could be in terms of the Quebec seats this time around?
Peter, Gilles Duceppe, and maybe to a lesser degree Elizabeth May, but Gilles Duceppe certainly is a leader that actually would like Canadians to want less change and not to be propelled by the need for change on Election Day. And the reason for that is that the more Quebec voters want change on Parliament Hill, the less they are likely to return to the Bloc, and the more they are likely to stick with the NDP or the Liberals, who have a shot at replacing Stephen Harper. So he faces a very different proposition from all of the other leaders. He actually needs to convince Quebecers that they have to switch to another opposition party rather than want to change the government. And so far, he's been back for a bit, month and a half. The oomph that the Bloc got in the polls seems to have faded away, because at this point, anecdotal evidence does suggest that Quebecers want regime change and not a change in their voice in Ottawa.
All right. Let's deal with what we heard from Stephen Harper and what we heard from Tom Mulcair. And obviously, let's begin with Stephen Harper, who has called the election now for October 19th. Not surprisingly, those two parties, we are looking at the risk versus change scenarios in terms of their main campaign themes. But Bruce, in terms of watching Harper, what was your take on the Conservative leader?
Well, the first thing that I'm reminded of when I watch Mr. Harper in this campaign is that unlike Mr. Mulcair or Mr. Trudeau, who are both pitching at 70% of the electorate, that number of people who are open to their parties and want change, Mr. Harper is really trying to win about 40% of voters. And so his strategy, his remarks are very much focused on trying to convince those people that they shouldn't consider the other parties and that they should stick with him. So it's a smaller audience, first of all. The second thing I noticed is that it was a very somber-sounding launch to an election campaign. In effect, Mr. Harper was kind of saying, look, I know it's not great, but it can't get any better. And as a way to launch an election campaign, I think maybe some of his supporters and probably some of his candidates were hoping for something that had a little bit more lift to it. I do think that the Conservatives were imagining 6 months ago that they would have a better economic situation to start this campaign off, but it is what it is. That having been said, I think that Mr. Harper describing things only in terms of how they could get worse is going to be a hard narrative to make people enthusiastic about for the 11 weeks ahead. I did notice the point that you raised earlier, Peter, that he mentioned the environment in French, and certainly that has been a weak flank for the Conservatives if they're going to try to win back some supporters in the province of Quebec. And the last thing I was struck by was he is placing a big bet on this security issue. It hasn't been looking as powerful a vote-getting issue in the last several months. Who knows whether that will be the case going forward? But he put an awful lot of emphasis on keeping us secure from threats in the world, and it remains to be seen if voters are going to pay a lot of attention to that part of his platform.
And the interesting thing about the use of the word environment was it didn't appear in the English text, or in at least what he delivered in English. Chantal, on Stephen Harper?
Well, I suspect that conservative strategists have put a cross on this day and decided that it was going to be lost to election timing. It certainly does take a lot of nerve for the Prime Minister to say he's calling this very long election to save taxpayers' money. This is a government that dropped over $1 billion in public funds in various pre-election announcements throughout last week. So I think that they understand that this day is going to be lost to this debate, that their narrative is shaky. They have decided that it's worth the risk of a lost day. I'll remind you that when Stephen Harper launched his first victorious campaign in 2005, remember, he went to the microphone and the first thing he did was talk about same-sex marriage, which probably had conservative candidates groan, as in, why are we getting out of the gate on this issue? But he actually managed to get the issue out of the way of the rest of the campaign by losing that first day. I didn't really notice, and I've looked at the French media, it didn't jump to anyone so far that he mentioned the environment in French and not in English. But I did get a press release, and I thought that was really interesting, summing up his remarks from the Conservative Party, and I was struck by the fact that in it, they called Justin Trudeau just Justin in both languages. Thomas Mulcair is entitled to a full name. I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but in both versions, Justin is Justin.
It's hard to imagine anything not being deliberate on a day like this. They've had,
in both
days to
languages.
figure it all out. Yeah. Okay, let's shift to Tom Mulcair. A very different kind of statement from him. You know, he alternated between French and English instead of giving one long French statement followed by one long English statement. He did not take questions. He did not mention security or ISIS. He covered a lot of other ground, though, in terms of what he said needs to be changed in Canada and why they feel they're the best agent of change. Bruce, on Tom Mulcair.
Well, I thought his statement was pretty good. I thought it seemed a little bit redundant in parts, and I'm curious, I guess, as to why he wouldn't take questions, because I think he's so effective when he's in the cut and thrust of political debate. Not that he's bad reading a statement like that, but I think that it's always a good opportunity for him when he can kind of freelance his message a little bit more, because he's so effective at it. I noticed that he was very much on the Stephen Harper's plan isn't working, and I think that really will be one of the central themes in this campaign. Either you think the economy is going as well as it could possibly go, or you're looking for something different. Mr. Mulcair didn't do anything to really flesh out what kinds of things he has in mind to kickstart the economy. He certainly didn't seem to want to talk about his position on things like pipelines or trade deals, and I think that's going to be something that he's going to have to deal with more going forward. And the last thing I would say is I noticed that he spent a fair bit of time talking about the number of conservatives who've been charged, jailed, convicted, who'd committed offenses of one sort or another, reminding people of this whole accountability question. And of course, we know that with the Mike Duffy trial set to resume next week, that could be an issue that becomes more topical for people in the weeks ahead. And certainly, Mr. Mulcair looks as though he wants to use it.
All right, I only got a minute before Elizabeth May begins her remarks. Chantal, on Mulcair.
On substance, the security issue is low in the pecking order of voters at this point. I'm sure he didn't want to raise it. I think he didn't want to get into the narrative over election timing, which he would have if he'd been asked questions. And I suspect that we are doing what they think is a better job of going after Stephen Harper on this than he would be cast as the opposition leader criticizing the Prime Minister. And I think that explains why no answer to questions. They're leaving this to Stephen Harper.
All right, let's go out to the West Coast. Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, is now speaking. Let's listen in.
Territory of the Wasanish people, and we accept their hospitality with gratitude. Haishka. Bienvenue ici pour le Parti Vert pour le
Welcome
commencement de
to
notre
the
campagne
beginning of our campaign at the Green Party, a tremendous
To
campaign.
start our campaign here on the shores of the Salish Sea, where we collectively here today are our British Columbia, some of our British Columbia MPs, most of our Vancouver Island MPs, recommitting to protecting the Salish Sea. And this may be somewhat unorthodox. I hope my colleagues will accept that a very great Canadian passed away last week, and her funeral is today in Ottawa, and under other circumstances, I would have been there for Flora MacDonald's funeral at Christ Church Cathedral. She was my friend, but she was also, for all of my life, my role model. She exemplified what it is to be Canadian and to represent the Canada we love. And although it may be somewhat unusual, I just want to say that I'd like to dedicate the Green Party campaign in this election to the memory of Flora MacDonald. She stood for principle. She was unwavering in her dignity, her integrity. And I ask each and every one of our candidates, and those of you, many of you are young, you may not have ever known Flora MacDonald or the sight of her in Parliament standing with her back ramrod straight with such dignity, while all around her were other people sort of yapping. I think of Flora and I ask our candidates to try to meet that high bar she set of grace, humor, dignity, diplomacy, and a selfless devotion to Canada. Just moments ago, Stephen Harper visited Rideau Hall and launched what will be one of the longest election campaigns in Canadian history, the longest in 140 years. Il sera 11 semaines, 78 days. I just heard the Prime Minister claim quite extraordinarily that this would not cost Canadian taxpayers more. My friends, he changed in the so-called Fair Elections Act, which of course is known generally across Canada as the Unfair Elections Act. He changed the rules to allow longer writ periods to allow parties to spend more money. Now, it's true, the rules are absolutely fair. The Green Party is equally allowed to spend $50 million in the next 11 weeks. And quite fairly, they have more money in the bank because people have given them that money, quite right. But what isn't right is to claim that the taxpayers aren't subsidizing this election. It's going to cost Canadians tens of millions of dollars more, because for all those horrible attack ads we're about to hear, we'll be bludgeoned in our own homes by attack ads. And every single attack ad, we're paying for half. And over the course of an election campaign of $50 million, of course the Conservatives get more money through this change, and they hope it disadvantages the others. And I say to Stephen Harper, shame on you for doing that. It costs taxpayers tens of millions of dollars more. Despite this cynical launching of a campaign, the cynical motivations, I want to say to Canada that the Green Party is ready. Le Parti Vert est prêt. Et à ce moment,
the Green Party is ready right now.
Comme évidemment, nous sommes éblouissantes.
And we are
buoyant. We are ready, and we are happy to take on this challenge. This is a national campaign launch, but it's also my local campaign here in Sydney by the Sea in Saanich Gulf Islands. So I want to begin by thanking the voters of Saanich Gulf Islands for putting their faith in me on May 2nd, 2011. I've worked hard for you. I hope I've earned your confidence for another time as your MP. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. It's incredible. This is a Sunday, and we're
Sunday morning of a long
in a
holiday
vacation.
Weekend. Happy BC Day, everybody. Our long holiday weekend. And here we are with hundreds of people who got a message on email yesterday. Can you come out at 6:30 in the morning? Because we have to be in time zones with the Prime Minister and Patal Mulcair. Listen, I'm so grateful to all of you for being out here this morning. The Green Party invites Canada to come to get to know us, because we're not what you think. The Green Party is not a one-issue party, and the Green Party is certainly not a one-person party. We have extraordinary candidates from coast to coast to coast. We are the opposite of a party of one.
All right, there you have Elizabeth May speaking with her supporters in Sydney, British Columbia today, the leader of the Green Party. hoping to increase the vote that the Green Party gets across the country and the number of seats. As you know, last time round, she was the single elected Green Party member in the 2011 election. Now, if you're wondering where the Liberal leader is, if you just joined us, we've seen all the leaders but Justin Trudeau. He's on a plane heading to the West Coast. He's going to be taking part in Vancouver Pride Day today, and he will be speaking later on today, 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and CBC News Network will cover that live. The Liberals made the decision that they would not be involved TV-wise, radio-wise, any method for this major opening of the campaign in terms of the coverage that surrounds the Rideau Hall announcement by Stephen Harper just a short time ago. But live coverage of Justin Trudeau at 2 o'clock Eastern Time on CBC News Network. Okay, the insiders are back, and one of the things that Jamie, Kathleen, and David were going to help us with, we all know this is the most scripted day of any campaign, day one. You know what your goal is, what your aim is, and what your statements are going to be, but you take risks. And days like this can prove daunting for leaders in the future if they fall prey to one of those risks. So did anyone? Jamie?
No, I think they all got off to a pretty good start, Peter. I mean, the Prime Minister obviously had some challenges around those questions about who was paying for this thing, but he had an answer and he stuck to it. Frustrated many.
He certainly stuck to it.
He stuck to it,
and
it frustrated many. But I think he probably, as Chantal said, concluded that they were going to lose today to that particular issue, and they've made the decision the issue will drop to one side. I thought Mulcair was quite strong in his remarks. Thought all of them could have used an edit, and it could have been a little bit shorter than
How about, though, not taking questions on Mulcair?
Well, again, I think he decided that he would let the Prime Minister hang out there today, and he didn't want to get knocked off his message. And I think probably he'll get away with it. I think it was a gamble worth taking.
Wow, Jamie being incredibly generous here today, Kathleen. Right?
I think the visuals look good, certainly for Mr. Harper, Mr. Mulcair.
They were stunning.
Even for Ms. May, those visuals were good. In terms of gaffes, I think that you're right, Peter. These are very scripted events, and certainly any director of communications worth their weight would have known that those questions about taxpayers subsidizing this longer election campaign would have come. So they made a deliberate choice to answer in that way. And while comms discipline, communication discipline, is appreciated in politics, I question whether the issue of the longer election campaign and the fact that taxpayers are subsidizing won't actually remain an issue throughout the campaign. It rarely does. I acknowledge that. But it did one time in 1990, and that was the David Peterson when he called an early election campaign. And voters throughout that campaign questioned Mr. Peterson, how come you're calling this early election? How come it's costing that much to taxpayers? So I wonder if we'll see this on the campaign trail going forward.
And to some degree for Jim Prentice in Alberta earlier this year.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, David, your take on all this?
Well, I don't think that I saw a gaffe there, although the Prime Minister had, I thought, a surprisingly weak explanation for why the election was being called at this point. I think a lot of people were speculating that something a little bit more substantive was going to be put forward there. But I don't think anybody made a mistake, but we did see some gambles being taken here. Let's start with Mr. Harper. He is intending to run on national security. Safety and economy are the two themes of his campaign. I'm unaware of a federal campaign that's ever really been run on a foreign policy question, ever really been run on the security of the country since World War II. Perhaps one of the Diefenbaker-Pearson fights earlier around nuclear weapons, but this is really an anomaly for them to try to make this a vote-deciding issue, and it'll be interesting to see if they can raise the salience of that issue to that level. On Mr. Mulcair's part, I think that he was walking a really interesting line. He knows that the NDP, if anything, will be attacked at being a high-risk proposition, never having been in the federal government before. And so I think he was quite at great pains to sound safe, to sound reassuring, to talk about change without talking about dramatic change, and to emphasize his personal experience in government. I guess the question is, if that remains the case over time in this campaign, there is a very large desire for strong change from the Harper government. Does that allow If the NDP are going to run that safely, does that allow them to be outflanked? Those are, I think, the gambles we saw on the table today.
Kathleen, just on to go back to the issue of questions. I mean, obviously, the NDP made a decision. Tom Mulcair made that decision not to take questions today, at least in the statement part of this day.
I think there'd be two strategies behind that. One being what Jamie has already mentioned, that let Stephen Harper have to answer for why he's called this election early. Let him hang out to dry. But the other thing is that you have to remember that campaign teams have been working for months to craft that opening statement, to figure out what the location would be, et cetera. And they actually want that to be the message, the first message that Canadians hear. And remember, this is going to be a slow start campaign. I'm sure that advertising dollars will go up, but I think the real main event, again, like I said earlier, is going to be this Thursday at the debate, and you'll actually probably see a pretty quiet few days, I'd imagine, Tuesday, Wednesday, as the leaders prepare for Thursday's big event.
You agree with that, Jamie?
Yeah, I think so. I think that at the end of the day, they just want to get through this liftoff, and I think they got through. They got through the liftoff. I think, the Prime Minister, as David said, clearly articulated what he's going to be running on. Now, can he pull it off? That's what we're going to all be watching for as well. And then Mr. Mulcair used a lot of language that I've seen and written for a lot of Conservatives, playing by the rules and, making choices in our family and those kinds of things. I was beginning to wonder who was giving that speech, right?
All right, listen, the Insider's with us, and they will be with us tonight on a special edition of The National as well. Jamie, Kathleen, and David, who is in Ottawa on this day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, let's go back up to Ottawa, outside Rideau Hall, which is probably a pretty lonely place right now. Terry Malevsky and Rosie Barton with their final thoughts on what we've witnessed today. Terry, you up first.
The outset of a classic change versus more of the same election. As your panelists have laid it out, this is the issue for Mr. Harper and for Mr. Mulcair. Mr. Trudeau will be a complicating factor for both of them, but it's change versus the everything's fine or as fine as it's going to be, and the other guys are going to drive the economy in the ditch. Therefore, for Mr. Mulcair, the essential thing is to make clear that he is not risky, that he's not going to drive the economy into a ditch. And I'll just point to one other thing. Advertising, the Conservatives, as you know, have begun ads suggesting that Mr. Mulcair is corrupt. The reason that the Justin Trudeau ads worked for many voters was that many of them did think that Justin Trudeau was not ready. With Mr. Mulcair, it's a little hard to sell because at this stage, most voters don't think that Mr. Mulcair is corrupt, as the new Conservative ads suggest.
All right. Rosie, your final thought.
Well, I would just say, where do we go from here? As Kathleen just said, I mean, I expect that this week is going to be a quieter week than normal. But this campaign is unlike any other for length and for money, certainly, but also because we've got two guys that have never done this before, Tom Mulcair and Justin Trudeau. How will they do? Can they handle the pace? Can they survive this long? How will a guy that's done it many times, Stephen Harper, manage to sustain messaging for 77 days? It's also going to be different because there isn't just two debates. There's many debates. And so that gives an opportunity for people to set targets, make mistakes, catch up on mistakes, and correct things at multiple times throughout the campaign. So I think that's something that's interesting to watch as well. And, it's going to be fascinating on social media, too. It was present in 2011 and 2008, not to this extent. So there's more room as well for people to be captured doing things that they shouldn't be doing on social media there. And opponents will take every opportunity. It's going to be a wild ride.
I'll say. And as you say, it's going to be likely a relatively quiet week. It may be a relatively quiet month for a campaign, unlike with the ones we've witnessed before. August, after all, is not a time for most Canadians to be going, boy, what's the latest on the campaign? I mean, I see in the crowd that was attracted there, aside from the reporters, just those two guys in the bearskin hats behind you were it turned out.
Now, to be fair, there was a whole crowd of people that biked over to see things. It was heartwarming for democracy.
All right. Rosie, thanks very much. Rosie Barton and Terry Malevsky outside Rideau Hall today. Well, as you've no doubt heard, this will be a different kind of election campaign, one unlike any Canada's seen before. Just as the leaders will make promises, so will we here at CBC News. Here it is. More individual Canadians will see and hear themselves in our election coverage than ever before. Sure, we'll show you what the politicians are saying and doing, much of it live as it happens as they crisscross the country over the next 11 weeks. And our top journalists will explain what it all means. Their insight and analysis will be woven throughout our coverage. There'll be special editions of Power and Politics and The House. Of course, At Issue, Canada's most watched political panel, and Rex will make frequent appearances on The National, as will The Insiders. But all our stories and all our programs will feature you, the voter, sharing your stories, your concerns, your issues. We will also have comprehensive coverage online, where our tools will be dynamic, interactive, shareable, whether it's through Vote Compass or a special new project we're developing with Google. You'll be able to connect with us like never before on all our CBC programs, whether it's radio, CBC television, or CBC News Network. And remember, you can get the latest news and developments at any time at cbcnews.ca. So let's recap what we have learned in this last 2 hours. To no one's surprise, the Prime Minister has called the election for October 19th. It will be the longest election campaign in modern Canadian history, perhaps even longer than modern. In fact, you got to go back to 1872 to see a campaign that has gone this long, 77, 78 days, depending on how you count that final day. So in those terms, we've got an October 19th campaign. We've heard from all the leaders save one. The Prime Minister made the opening remarks. He talked about too risky to go anywhere other than the Conservative Party right now. Tom Mulcair led the charge of those parties who want the top job by saying change is needed, change is what Canadians want, and they, the NDP, are offering change. And Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, 2 o'clock Eastern Time on CBC News Network. If you're watching on CBC television, we're going to take you back to our regularly scheduled programming in progress.